not have been aware of the issue of conflict on the continent. During the 1990s, it was almost called the continent of conflict. You had wars in over a dozen countries over a period of time. I tried to list them here. I had, Sudan that had been going on for several decades, both with Darfur and with South Sudan. You had the tragedy in Rwanda, which was triggered by the intervention by the Rwandan Patriotic Front. That was in itself an invasion. You had huge killings and massacres in Burundi. You had the crisis in Somalia when the government of Siad Barre fell, and which we are still dealing with the consequences of today. You have a civil war in Chad. You had the Central African Republic, most recently having its government ousted by a rebel group or an amalgamation of different rebel groups. People may remember that there were two bursts of war between Ethiopia and Eritrea that were at one point the most heavily armed conflicts that were going on in the world. You had the meltdown in Cote d'Ivoire. And then, of course, you had the issues with the Lord's Resistance Army in Uganda, which was linked with Sudan. And then the longest running one would be the Democratic Republic of the Congo. That leaves out Liberia, Angola, and Sierra Leone. So you can see that Africa has had more than its share, and certainly the all of the citizens in those countries have suffered more than enough. What does that conflict mean? Well, it has meant internal displacements in Sudan and South Sudan, 5 to 6 million, 1 to 2 million people during the conflict. Of course, in Rwanda, it's between 500,000 and 1 million. Somalia, the death toll at one point was given as 500,000, but we've just since heard yesterday that humanitarian deaths as a result of the famine, which arguably are linked to the conflict and the lack of stability and security to produce food, resulted in the deaths of about over 230,000 in 2012. The numbers are staggering. There was a reason that the African governments were one of the key constituencies driving this arms trade treaty, because they are dealing with the consequences of it. They still are at the moment. You have the crisis that's going on in Mali, which threatens not only that country but also Chad and the whole Western Maghreb. You have continued insurgencies in Somalia, and of course you have ongoing conflicts, the fighting in the DRC, which seems to ebb and flow and only attracts the attention of the international community when a certain threshold has been reached or when there's some egregious type of violation. So Africa definitely has been waiting for an arms trade treaty and fighting for one, because, as Rachel pointed out, it's not only the death toll, but it's the damage to livelihoods. It's the damage to the security of women who are being raped. It's the use of child soldiers that it's facilitated by these small arms and conventional weapons. It's the displacement of people I've mentioned. UNHCR estimated about 29 million people having been displaced as a result of conflict. And that's just conflict, because the other side of the equation is the role that small arms and conventional weapons are playing in non-conflict situations, the ones that, quote unquote, don't attract attention, the internal policing activities that result in massacres or in abuses. I had put together with my colleague Felipe a couple of case studies to talk about, just to illustrate the gravity of the situation. I'll start off with Cote d'Ivoire, where the numbers in terms of the death toll start at 1,500, but clearly access to all of the killing sites still is going to probably push that number up. Now, how does a conflict continue or erupt? With weapons. Where do the weapons come from? There are no manufacturing facilities on the continent. These are weapons that are being sold into the continent from outside sources. They're being sold without any qualms about the consequences that those weapons could contribute to, whether the government even has complete command and control over the weapons that it may buy, and certainly without any regard for the cleanup process or the threats that the post-conflict situation continues to have because of the inability to collect the weapons or to actually control the soldiers who and the armed fighters who have those weapons. The weapons in the Cote d'Ivoire conflict ranged from small arms to light weapons to ammunition. They ended up in the hands of human rights abusers, as well as the government armed forces who, if you remember, were fighting against the northern part of the country. There was, in spite of a UN arms embargo, there were huge transfers that were going on. And these were going on from a number of different countries, including France. Then in 2010 and 2011, after the actual fighting had stopped or subsided, but when there were still human rights violations, there were still transfers going on. Amnesty released a report about a month and a half ago documenting the fact that the countries that produced weapons that were selling them to the Ivorian government knew that the abuses were going on and still sold them. The other case study that I'd like to refer to, of course, is the Democratic Republic of the Congo, which has just been a horrific situation, probably going back to 1995 when the end of the Rwandan genocide resulted in the locating of the former Rwandan government and its armed forces and its militias on the border of the DRC, which then triggered a military action by the new Rwandan government that pushed into the DRC and eventually resulted in the toppling of the Mobutu government. The Congolese security forces had an incredibly bad human rights record. That didn't prevent foreign and Western governments from transferring weapons to them, and it also didn't prevent, unfortunately, weapons being sent to the Rwandan Patriotic Front that were then used in the takeover of the DRC. The case study for the Democratic Republic of the Congo illustrates the issue of control, or the lack of it, of not only the soldiers but also of the actual weapons and stockpiles. Because one of the things that's been consistent is that even when well-intentioned military support or security assistance, even from the United States, is given to the government of Joseph Kabila, the weapons suddenly appear in the hands of the rebels. You may remember the name M23, which was an armed group in the eastern part of the DRC that was fighting to retain control of a particular particular state. The weapons that were being used against the the government's forces were ones that had been previously in the hands of the National Army. So there are clearly issues of responsibility that an arms trade treaty will start to help us address. I will echo what Rachel said, that this is not the panacea and it's not going to solve everything, but at the moment we have nothing. This is a huge step forward. I think I'll skip the Darfur one because I think you're beginning to get the drift. But I want to talk about Rwanda because it was in some ways seminal for Africa and for the global community, because it was one of the first times that people used the term genocide in the modern period. And many people continue to focus on the fact that most of the killings and the genocide in Rwanda were done by machetes. What they don't stop to think about is that rounding up people with machetes wouldn't have happened. It would have been too inefficient. It was guns that basically forced people into locations where they could be easily dispatched by the Interahamwe and by the Rwandan government's armed forces. Where did those guns come from? Well, they came from the Hutu government's supporters, which included France, Egypt, and South Africa. That, I think, is really what we're up against here in terms of how do you change this continent from being something that is being ravaged by conflict to a continent that can actually devote the resources that Rachel referred to into development, into health, into education, and sort of address the larger issues of poverty. I think as we're looking forward with the Arms Trade Treaty, what are the things that are going to happen, or what are the implications? I think there are four issues that this treaty can help drive, which have been chronic challenges for African governments. Oversight, transparency, human rights, and accountability. If there is indeed a legitimate role for weapons, which we all have to acknowledge there is, then the treaty encourages professional, correct behavior by governments in order to be able to receive weapons, to purchase weapons. The treaty is not only an incredibly big attempt to try to regulate the export and sale from the countries that make these weapons, it's also an effort to try to clean up the recipients by creating standards that Rachel referred to. Because if the lack of consistency now has meant that, sure, there's a problem in this country X, but that's really not an issue because I have my protocols about when I sell, to whom I sell, and why I can't sell. Now there actually is going to be a common standard. Now there's going to actually be a requirement to document what you sell and who receives it. Now there's going to be an opportunity to ask questions and to push governments into not making transfers, to abide by the letter of the treaty. It also opens up the possibility of creating internal transparency in these African countries, ideally so that NGOs in those countries, the media in those countries, can ask questions about where the arms are going, how they're being used, who's using them, and whether they are indeed benefiting the national security of the country that's receiving them. On the flip side, the goal, hopefully, for this treaty is to curb or to reduce the illegitimate and irresponsible transfers. You know, people have focused on different parts of this treaty. I think that's understandable, but they're forgetting that no one in the Arms Trade Treaty effort ever. Well, I take that back. Some elements of the Arms Trade Treaty coalition obviously would have wanted to actually see an end to the trade in small arms and conventional weapons. That's fine. That's their business. But there are others who actually understand that countries are always going to have national security needs. They're also always going to have the needs for weapons. But we have to and we can make those weapons be used in a more responsible manner, and their sale and their transfer shouldn't be a free-for-all as it has been up until now. Now, there are a couple of questions, I guess, maybe around some immediate impacts or potential impacts. For example, what happens with Mali? What happens with Somalia? What happens with the government in Somaliland? Or what happens with transfers for the Democratic Republic of the Congo, and where you have the need for a professional military, but you also have an armed group that is sponsored by other actors in the region that may not hold to these standards. I think ideally this treaty will tighten up those supply lines and make the governments or the actors that are supporting armed groups have a much bigger challenge in providing those weapons, because they themselves will have to answer to what their purchases or their transfers are resulting in. In other words, if country X receives a sale of weapons, where do those weapons end up? That is the responsibility of that recipient country to track those. And hopefully we can begin to sort of address this bleeding issue, or the leakage, so to speak, of weapons into the wrong hands. It's not going to be easy. You know, getting the treaty to come into force is the next step. Ratification is the step beyond that here in the United States. And application and implementation in Africa is going to be a challenge, but it has to happen because of the statistics that I was talking about earlier. The continent has to move forward, and if conflict is not something that is addressed effectively, which you need an ATT for, everything else I think is put on hold. I'll just end by saying that Rachel did an amazing amount of work in bringing this treaty to where we are now. I think the treaty actually showed not only that change can happen and can be driven by individuals, but that this large population of people who are impacted by the arms trade can be mobilized. In other words, there was enough pressure that no one was able to walk away from the treaty and drop it. And I think that was incredibly important. And that's something that we should remember even as we face our daily challenges and trying to keep our governments to protect human rights. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Adote Akwe from Amnesty International. So I just want to formulate one question and give the speakers the opportunity to talk to each other for a moment while the audience is formulating their questions. And that is one of the things that surprised me the most in the last couple of years in what I've learned about international relations was from Rachel's former colleague, Joe Cirincione, who's now the president of Plowshares Foundation. And he pointed out in his book on nuclear weapons, published a few years ago, that Africa is a nuclear weapon-free continent because of successful arms control. Now, there are some very obvious differences between nuclear weapons and small arms and conventional weapons. But there are some interesting lessons there maybe, and there are also probably some very different things about the political climate today. I can see, for example, the rise of democratization, the rise of civil society, changing the constituencies within Africa in interesting ways. I can see the effort of the ATT to create legitimate commerce and brand something as illegitimate commerce being an effective wedge, perhaps within the trade. But we also know that the illicit arms trade is inextricably bound with the drug trade everywhere around the world, and that trade is extremely efficient and has changed very little, no matter what sort of regulation has been tried. So what I'm asking is, can you walk us through a little bit about what can and cannot be learned from that analogy, leaving aside the technical differences between these weapons? I mean, what do we know about the political context today that might make the ATT work globally, diplomatically?
So I'm gonna answer your question, Carl.
Sure.
I promise. I wanted to build upon something that Adote said because, again, going back to just thinking about this being 1 month since we've had this victory, and I think it's not the other lesson that I would add to Adote's very good list about that civil society can make a difference and that impacted governments can make a difference is also that the United Nations, for all of its faults, was able to pull this off in the sense that this is still the only forum where every state has an equal voice. And I think that we lose that a little bit with all of the criticisms we hear about the United Nations, that this treaty demonstrated that giving an affected state and the state that's selling the arms to them the same voice, you can have a good outcome. And I think that we shouldn't lose that, and that we can use international forums to achieve the desired outcome. I also, thinking about what Carl just mentioned, I had made a list of all of the ways that an ATT could assist Africa. And then I realized it wasn't just Africa, but for the purposes of today's discussion, it's how the ATT could assist Africa. And I think the challenge with a continent like Africa that has been kind of mired in conflict for so long is that and we think of it as, oh, there must be so many weapons in Africa. And in reality, Africa is not as heavily armed as Europe or as the United States. Well, nobody's as heavily armed as the United States, but even as Europe or Central America. And I think it's not necessarily the number of weapons or where the weapons come from, but it's how they are used and for what purpose they got there. And that's where I think this illicit piece comes in, that when you're looking at the ATT and what it's going to do, that because it for the first time says there is a link between the illicit trade and the legal trade, and thus if you better regulate the legal trade, you by its very nature are going to be able to better control who has weapons and for what purpose, that is going to make an impact not only in Africa but around the world. And that this illicit trade in weaponry is not even just tied to guns. I mean, it's tied to drugs. It's tied to illicit trafficking around the world. I mean, just a little plug for Stimson and the Managing Across Boundaries program. This is exactly what we do. We say all of these issues are very much interlinked, whether it is the trafficking of nuclear materials or radiological weapons to, illicit pharmaceuticals or human trafficking or illicit animal products. I mean, all of these items use shipping companies and freight forwarders and the same brokers and sometimes the same flights on the way up and maybe bringing weapons on the way back. It's got illicit timber, say from Liberia or something like that, blood diamonds, you name it. So I think we have to kind of keep in mind this interconnectedness of the illicit market in general. And I think, while I have tremendous respect for Joe Cirincione, I'm not sure that these are of equal footing, that the conventional arms trade by its very nature is legal. It's going to have legitimate purposes. The nuclear arms trade, not so much. And there's political will to keep that technology out of the hands of those who don't have it. Not only do you not have that political will with regards to let's not sell weapons, to the contrary, you have people saying, actually, I'm a rebel group. I think I have an illegitimate government. I'm being oppressed. And there is support for arming those groups that some don't see as legitimate actors in the world community. So I think you're stuck in this kind of no man's land of trying to put rules on a system that by its very nature just hasn't needed or had a lot of rules before. And just as my last point, kind of some of these other pieces that would be assisted within Africa for having an arms trade treaty. One of the provisions of the ATT is to provide cooperation and assistance from governments that have the resources to those that not only don't have the resources, but maybe don't have the technical capacity or financial capacity to develop those systems. And so it establishes a framework for that cooperation and assistance to occur, which I think will be incredibly useful, and particularly for Africa, where so many of the regions, whether you look at East Africa, West Africa, Southern Africa, are very much integrated in terms of their economies and their trade patterns, that if you're able to harmonize not only systems globally, but if you're able to harmonize the systems across those regions, it kind of, everyone has the same capacities, everyone has the same systems. It makes it easier to stop that illicit trade at various borders as well. So I think the ATT thought, we were very thoughtful, I should say, about what will help affected governments and affected countries, but also what are the resources and the programs that donor governments might have that could actually provide assistance down the road.
Aditya, do you want to respond to that briefly?
Yeah, no, I think it's an interesting question. I would have said that one of the major differences in Rachel's former colleague, his comments is basically that, for the most part, the nuclear proliferation issue in Africa is, I would argue, not pertinent just because it's beyond the means of most of the countries, whereas the arms trade treaty is not only within their means, it's actually in their house, and it's causing destabilization. I think, for me, the treaty, and I'm approaching this very much in a human rights fashion, the treaty establishes standards, and the standards are brought into the Constitution and the rule of law in that country. In other words, the government is signed up to it. That in itself is a huge legitimizer about questioning and demanding transparency and accountability for the government on its performance. In other words, you purchased, 100 boxes of Kalashnikovs from someone. Where are they? You couldn't ask these kinds of questions before because this is not for ordinary citizens like us to ask these questions. The Ministry of Defense knows what it's doing. The soldiers know what they're doing. Silence. I think clearly one shouldn't read in too much or expect too much, but it changes that because there's now not only the opportunity to question within the country, but of course to question from outside, and that I think is really a fundamental step towards governance, which is a huge challenge, as you know, for the continent, because even with the emergence of more democratic governments and larger civil societies, there are still many no-go areas, and usually security and military issues are the first no-go area of an emerging democracy, because that's the last piece of effective, undisputed control that a government has, and so they won't surrender that. And until we actually can break that kind of silence, or we can't get to impunity. We can't get to the effective civilian control over the armed forces, and we can't get to professionalization. Is the military performing in a way that is indeed in keeping with its obligations? So I think it's a major component of that. I wouldn't say that it's going to solve the whole thing, but I think that's one aspect of it that I think is going to be incredibly important in this treaty.
Great. So thank you, Adete. So we have about 20 minutes for questions. Please identify yourself. Please keep your questions brief, and I'm going to parsimoniously repeat your question for the benefit of the podcast and those listening. Travis, you get the first question.
Great. I think my question goes, a lot of our conversation so far has been about sort of the arms trade treaty is a good first step, but there need to be following steps. So I think my question from an American perspective is, what role can the American government and institutions like AFRICOM have in, for instance, the demobilization or disarmament processes that are going to be so necessary to help stem the tide of the small arms trade and help reduce those negative consequences of conflict?
Okay, maybe one more question. We can answer the two together. All right, we'll start with that one. So the question was, what's the role of the U.S. government and, for example, new organizations like AFRICOM, which is the DoD's Africa Command, in demilitarization and in maybe moving the ATT forward at a programmatic level?
I'll try and start. I think as the United States is the largest arms manufacturer in the world based on the value of its exports. As such, it has an incredibly large shadow over the arms trade, in addition to the fact that it actually has, at the moment, the strongest standards in terms of the export of its weapons. So for those reasons alone, it's been critical to have the U.S. be part of the negotiations, help the adoption, which they did, and now sign. Having President Obama or some other senior official in the U.S. government actually sign it and conveys to the rest of the world that, as the biggest player at the table, we are committed to making this happen, and since we're going to play by the rules, we expect everybody else to play by the rules. Informally, I think that would be the subtext. Very important, especially for the other large exporters, and also for the shall we call them the outlier states who are at best ambivalent about the treaty. Now, the question of AFRICOM, while related in the sense that you're talking about trying to improve the performance of recipient governments in Africa is actually a separate track, because what we're trying to do here is to make sure that that both parties do not do anything that contributes to human rights violations, and that there's accountability and transparency. The AFRICOM role has all sorts of different analysis to it. The most benign being that it is indeed about professionalizing African militaries. Now, professional, civilian-controlled, rule-respecting or the laws of war respecting militaries is a huge benefit for Africa, just as it is for any other part of the world. You want a military that doesn't get into politics. You want a military that doesn't commit atrocities. You want those things, just as you want the same thing for the rest of the security apparatus. One would assume that the people in AFRICOM would be sitting down with their counterparts in other African countries and saying, well, we now have some more of a roadmap on how we can help professionalize you. And we would just like to say that this is going to be a filter that we have to go through before we can suggest military assistance or security assistance in the form of weapons. We hope that you take this as seriously as we do, because once these are standards that we are going to implement and abide by. I think that would probably be the most constructive way I would see AFRICOM contributing to that.
I would just add to that not only is the United States the world's largest exporter of weapons, but it's also the largest provider of assistance programs to not only conduct demilitarization, demobilization programs, but also in terms of weapons destruction and stockpile management, which are incredibly important through the State Department's weapons removal and abatement program in conjunction with the Department of Defense's Defense Threat Reduction Agency programs. So I think that's incredibly important. That's another piece. It's not those are kind of what do you do with the things that are already there. And the EXPIS program is Export Control and Border Security, is training governments in the best ways to develop legislation, train border security, et cetera. I think you will see more of that happen, not only from the United States, but globally as well. So I think there's a large, I like Adete's way of saying, there's a large shadow of U.S. arms sales, but I think there's also a lot of existing and potential responsibility to make sure that shadow isn't a scary shadow and maybe is like a nice shadow puppet. That, I don't know, I was looking for something like, what's something not scary about a shadow, but a nice shadow, a way in which that influence of a very strong and useful U.S. system can actually help with and allow the United States to be more responsible about the weapons that it does sell abroad.
Since we're introducing Rachel to Africa in this conversation, we can't but help mention Kwame Nkrumah's vision of a shadow government. So please, the questions. Jeff?
Sure. Hi, I'm Jeff Abramson, who Rachel and Adete know me well. I used to lead the Secretariat of the Global Coalition of Control Arms that pushed for the treaty. I have a comment and then a question. One thing also when we're talking about Africa, I echo what Rachel and Adete said about how not all African countries acted together, not surprisingly, but in general, Africa did work very well as a bloc to demand that the treaty be stronger than it might have been otherwise. And also, interestingly, we sometimes forget Africa is not, the states supplying Africa are not only Western ones, but China actually now is much more involved. And Africa actually played a very big role in convincing China to consider much more in the treaty than they would have otherwise. As a campaign strategy, we often would sort of tell our African delegates to go talk to China when we were having trouble with them. So it will be interesting to see how in this globalized world with the relationships that Africa actually has, how it is using those in the arms trade and more broadly. that's a potentially interesting side comment maybe. Your last question was about the U.S., and I guess I want to flip the question and ask, these may be more towards to Adate than Rachel, whether Africa is ready to step up, is maybe a funny way to put it. In talking with a lot of delegates who would discount Africa, to be perfectly honest, they would say, well, Africa just can't get their act together. I don't think that's fair, but Africa already has actually some very strong regional instruments to stop the flow of weapons that are stronger than the Arms Trade Treaty. And Rachel will know these, she's an Africanist as well. But they're not working. So it's hard to know whether the Arms Trade Treaty layered on top will make a difference, or if the problem is sort of endemic to governance, which is the term Adate mentioned. So, I am similarly optimistic as Adate is that this will be a tool, and that African governments, especially their civil societies and media, hopefully will have the possibility to hold their governments accountable. But what do you see the trend in this issue area, given that there already have been local efforts or ECOWAS also in Eastern Africa, and some in Southern as well? Is this a positive layering on? Is there lessons to be learned about past efforts that give us hope that this new international effort will make a difference there?
Thanks. One more question, maybe? Okay, Caleb Rossiter.
Thank you. Lovely to see you all. Some of us can remember 1993 in those meetings.
I think my first meeting in Washington, I heard Caleb talking about an arms trade treaty. Yeah.
You don't look a day.
Oh. Thanks, Caleb.
Just a quick aside. I know Carl loves to bring in his other great interests here. Before I ask my question, I just have to say, probably you can thank Israeli intelligence and AFRICOM racism for the fact that there's no nuclear weapons on the continent. One took care of Egypt's, and the other made sure they didn't pass any nuclear weapons, which they had built, over to
Right.
the ANC. Now, the motivation for the treaty is precisely as both of our distinguished advocates of human rights have said. That's really what led us all to the table in 1993 in Washington, and then in 1995 to start working with Dr. Arias. But unfortunately, as I read the treaty, and I know there's a difference between the letter of the law and the spirit of the law, having worked a lot on the landmine treaty, you don't want to read that too carefully. The itsy-bitsy words have lots of ways for governments to try to cheat and get around it, but that's not important. We created a stigma against using landmines as a coward's weapon that is much stronger than anything in the treaty. So I don't mean to be critical in the sense that you cannot use this treaty to create international norms. But as I read the letter of the treaty a few weeks ago, I was disturbed at the weakness of it. It seems to do 4 things, and 2 of them are already under UN Security Council relating to arms embargoes and things of that nature. The language on not giving weapons in the middle of a genocide, I think it's nice to have that as a principle, but that's probably covered somewhere in international law, and very few governments are going to admit they're exporting for a genocide. I hope, Adote, that transparency can be demanded by civil society in Africa based on this. That's a huge goal, as you know, and have worked on. But as you read the reporting language in the treaty right now, it's pretty loose. You don't have much to hang your hat on as you show up at the Ministry of Defense in Abuja and say, I'd like to see.
Yeah.
I'd like to see.
Good luck.
I'd like to see where those 100 weapons went.
Yeah.
I think Rachel pointed it out well. She said, look, the United States does everything that's in this treaty, and in some ways our human rights language is even stronger. Yet we are the world's largest exporter to dictators and to developing world, and have always been under Democrats and Republicans alike. It seems to me that the loss, where we lost the code of conduct we talked about, the Arias, was a no arms to dictators, who had a very pure standard that you couldn't give it to a country that was not chosen by its people, and a little bit broader than that.
Yeah.
But that went out in 1999 with the beginning of the negotiation of the European Union Code. And now we're down to, I think, hortatory language that might be able to be used. But I'd like your impression. Maybe I'm missing something in the treaty, but I don't see where it would stop anybody who wanted to export what they're doing today from exporting tomorrow. So the problems all remain, the weapons all remain. To kind of paraphrase the NRA, arms don't repress people, dictators repress people. There's going to be arms there, as Cote says. The question still is governance on the continent and the abetting of non-democratic governance by the United States. If you arm Ethiopia and you arm because they help in the war on terror, you can't really talk about we're going to be reducing the presence of weapons in repressive hands on the continent.
Let me repeat those questions and interject one quick thing. So Jeff's question began with a comment, which is that not all African countries acted together, but there was a block, that the interests weren't all in step, but there was a regional expression of sentiment about this. But also the involvement of China has changed the equation. And so this globalization of the issues it poses a question about how it'll affect how African countries respond and implement and perhaps use this treaty. His question related to implementation, instead of looking at the U.S., is Africa ready to step up, as he put it delicately? Africa already has, perhaps indelicately, Africa already has strong regional instruments, and many of these instruments are not working. Caleb Rossiter pointed out very good points that I would agree with about Afrikaner racism and the role of Israeli intelligence on South African nukes. But I do think and perhaps Egypt, yeah. But I do think, there was a strong sentiment underway even before you get to 89 or 1990 in South Africa. Maybe they saw the writing on the wall. And Libya was also, somewhat in the equation still. And then he asked a very good question. He said, as I read the treaty, the words have ways around them. He's asking the question, have we created enough of a stigma for the arms trade that there actually will be a new kind of international norm? So perhaps his constructivist sympathies and international relations theory are seeping through. I'm not sure. Or maybe his liberalism.
Thank God I don't know what that means.
And he asked the question, can transparency practically be demanded by African civil society organizations? That in addition to the reporting language being opaque, can civil society really go down to the Ministry of Defense and say, when did you buy weapons, how many did you buy, and where are they, and how are they being used? There are many good mechanisms already in place, and this really maybe brings us back to the questions of governance. If I can just indulge myself very briefly, I can think of two, relevant examples with that. I mean, one, of course, is when Nigeria's Ministry of Finance started publishing information about billions of dollars of transfers from the central government to the states. Their hope was that civil society would embrace this information and make sure the money was spent properly. And it didn't really work. The experiment didn't work as well as some people hoped. Another thing I would ask is that, only 2 weeks ago, Resolve and about a dozen other organizations sent a letter to the administration urging them to not suspend assistance to the Central African Republic despite a coup d'etat, which speaks directly to Caleb Rossiter's question about governance, and perhaps this says, are we ready to step up here in the U.S.?
So I'll be a little all over the place trying to answer all of this, but I think Jeff's point about Africa not as a bloc is important. I think we were saying Africa, I think we were really referring to sub-Saharan Africa. Although I have to say that while North Africa was a bit peculiar in that they, as a whole, also did not have a position, because you had very progressive leaning governments within North Africa, which were not only instrumental in, the UN's a funny place for a lot of reasons, but there's an Africa group, and then there's an Arab group, and the Arab group has some of the African countries, and also some of the Arab group is in the African countries. So you have some overlap there, which, while some would think would be very unhelpful, was actually quite helpful in terms of moderating perhaps the Arab groups' positions, but also is kind of forcing the sub-Saharan Africans to step up and maybe get their act together a little bit more, because they didn't want to see their perspectives lost. I also think we can't forget that while in the UN, the Africans weren't all together necessarily, there was a common position that the African Union, which does include North Africa as well as Sub-Saharan Africa, did agree to, that was very strong language in support of not only an ATT, but of the principles, many of which Caleb pointed out. So I think that there is, that we can't lose sight of that. And that kind of goes to Jeff's second point, which is, we have the ECOWAS Convention, the Nairobi Protocol, the SADC Protocol, et cetera. All of the different regions in Africa have very strong language about stopping the flow of arms. I think there are a lot of reasons those don't work, some of which, the ECOWAS Convention is legally binding, but some of those other protocols are not. They're politically binding. And frankly, there isn't a lot of political will if getting weapons at some point serves your purpose. So again, going back to the point I made at the beginning, this isn't about banning anything. It's about putting in place systems that didn't previously exist to better prevent that, not only the leakage from the legal to the illicit market, but to also ensure in a variety of ways that weapons are used in the ways that they are intended and by whom they are intended. And that it gives not only the importers the responsibility to say, this is who has the weapons, but it gives the exporters kind of a button to press and say, we sold you these, how are they being used, where are they being used, and by whom are they being used? And I'm not sure that pressure point existed in some of these places before. So I think that's important. I think there is a political will within particularly sub-Saharan Africa to have this tool, because it gets them access to resources and assistance that they wouldn't have had otherwise, which has made implementation of those regional pieces very difficult. But I also think it gives those of us who are observing a lever, a tool to put pressure on those governments to say, hey, you advocated for this, you asked it, now ask for it now, and you got it. Now step up and live by the obligations that are outlined in the treaty. So I'm hoping to see, again, I don't think this is going to happen in the next 5 to 10 years, but I'm hoping that, 15, 20 years from now, we can look back and say, you know what, some good was done by this instrument, that it's not just the piece of paper that it's written on. And that gets me to Caleb, who I've always loved for his dose of realism, and which is important, because I think you have to be a bit idealistic about the ATT. I think, yes, if you read the text very strictly, you can be concerned that it's not as strong. I don't agree that it's weak. I would say it's not as strong as some of us would like. I think part of that goes into, again, the fact that this happened in the United Nations system, where you had very competing interests that were ongoing. And we could have had an ATT that was much stronger, for sure, if it was done outside of the UN system. Personally, and the reason that I was committed to it within the UN system, unlike, I think, a lot of other weapons out there that we've talked about today, whether it was landmines or not, this is a trade that affects every single country. And I wanted a forum where every single country had a voice. Some of those voices I don't like so much, to be honest with you. I didn't like Iran, I didn't like DPRK, and I didn't like Syria there on that last day. But some of those voices I think were important. I do think it's important to have the United States on board. It's the world's largest exporter. If it would have happened in a process outside of the UN, you wouldn't have had the U.S. involved. And while some of the language might have been stronger, I'm not sure the impact, whatever it will be as great. I also think that, again, going to your point about the spirit of the treaty, I think is important. We were creatively ambiguous in many places where we knew that states who wanted to interpret the treaty and needed a way to interpret the treaty in a broad way would be able to. And those that really don't want to interpret this as a norm-setting exercise, they're not going to anyway. Either they're not going to be states parties, or they were never intending to be serious about their obligations. And so by wording things, whether it's transparency, as you were discussing, one of my favorite, and we can talk about it now, there's a comma. There's a comma. I put in a comma that the editors tried to take out. I was like, no, this is a very important comma, that literally, that allows you the flexibility, now I have to find my comma, in reporting, that it allows you to say, oh, actually, we can get access to information that perhaps we would not. You shall make these reports available, comma, and distribute them to states' parties. So they are available if a state wants to make them available. But states may not want to make them available because it's, again, based on national implementation. But they shall make them available to the United Nations, and the United Nations shall distribute them to others. And so you may not be able to go to Abuja, but you may be able to go to the United Nations or whoever the Secretariat is to get access to those. So it may be a step removed, but there are some creative things that we've done in here. In terms of the criteria, they do not line up with the criteria of the original discussions, not only here in Washington, but in the Arias Code and in the Nobel Laureates Code, or even in Amnesty's Framework Convention of 99. But I think if you look at not only the prohibitions, which my understanding was you were not prohibited from selling weapons if you thought they might be used for genocide. So I do think that this was a step forward. It's not a good idea. No one's going to say they're going to do it. But now, again, you have something a stick. It's not just a carrot, but it's also a stick. But if you look at the list of the criteria in Article 7, it not only elevates things like gender-based violence up into a category that they weren't in before, but also says, you know what, we're going to put on the table that this has always been a balance, right? States no one wanted to say this. No one wanted to say, you know, maybe some bad things are going to happen, but it's really important for our national security. Now, not only are we saying that's what really happens, that we're not all idealistic and saying, you know, we never sell arms when we think bad things are going to happen. No, we know bad things potentially could happen. These are lethal tools of violence. But we have to demonstrate clearly within our national governments that the risk is worth the benefit. And if it doesn't, if it's just because it's good for business or it's good for the economy, then you shall not do it. And I think that's important. So it says what really happens, and it says now you have to prove to me that the risk does not override that benefit. And I think that's an important step forward. Certainly, could those criteria have been stronger? Absolutely. But I think based on a consensus process, this really was far beyond where I thought we were going to end up, and truly was the best we were going to do to get the P5, the permanent 5 members of the Security Council of the U.S., Russia, France, China, and the United Kingdom, who are the largest exporters in the world, to get not only them on board, but to also get the recipient countries to say this is okay with us as well. Not perfect, best we can do.
Adote, if you're quick, we can get to one more question.
Well, no, I mean, she said everything, and she said it much more eloquently. I think the only thing I would add would be that both Caleb and Jeff have you've spoken about governance and about, you know, is there governance to implement this, to make to either establish the new norm, a normative culture, or is there enough capacity for them to step up and be quote unquote effective participants? And I think Rachel actually broke it down very, very, very well. It creates an opening in country, yes, small, but external, and in for questions to be asked, for transparency to be sought. That's on civil society to step into that space. Here. Oh, here. Absolutely here. And you know, the good news is that the internet has changed things. It's made that kind of, well, my goodness, look at what they're saying here and what they're saying there. And what they're not saying, what they're not talking about there, much more possible. And you know, even as I say this, I'll be the first one to say that we're now seeing that civil society is being targeted in Africa because of this potential probing and monitoring role and being delegitimized. So we have to, but it's certainly the onus is now on civil society in these exporter countries to step up and say, you signed this, you've ratified it. Why? Why are you doing it? Why are you still selling to country X, country Y? And that's going to be hopefully the difference between this treaty. But your points are all absolutely on the mark in terms of, the challenge. The treaty is a step forward, but that's it. It's a step forward. Big, but it's not the step into any kind of promised land.
And it's not just to say, it's not just for in this country, to answer Caleb's point about doing that here. It's not just for us to say, United States government, why are you doing X, Y, and Z? But to say to the United States government, you now have this tool. Go pressure other governments that are doing things that we would prefer them not to do to live up to these standards. So it gives the U.S. government also a tool by which not just other exporting states, but recipient states to say, no, you need to keep better track of how these weapons are being used or where they're being used. So it's a double-edged or dual benefit. It's a dual benefit that it allows countries or civil society to question their own governments, but also to question or push governments to use this as a tool in with other governments as well.
If we have no further questions, then I want to briefly thank.
Just a quick, this might be more directed towards Adite, but I'm sure Rachel could express it.
I always have something.
So you discussed taking a step back and looking at this as a process, and it was ongoing. So this might be tough to answer because it has been so long. If, in both of your opinion, you can ask from a civil society perspective, or Rachel, maybe you want to talk about UN perspective. What was maybe the one thing that really got this momentum pushing forward? What was the one tactic you used, and what, looking back, you kind of answered my next question, was civil society's role ongoing now. But during the process, what do you think was, in your opinion, the most effective to sort of push this momentum forward? Because it was something that started off, people didn't think it was possible.
Yeah. It's interesting to have Caleb here.
Question?
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Well, the question was, from the civil society perspective, from the international perspective, what actually gave this issue momentum? I mean, what moved it forward?
Yeah. I think clearly the involvement of civil society in finding lead governments who basically said, you know what, we're committed to doing this, and we're going to fight the good fight. And these were not the large exporting governments, obviously, but they were critical governments in that they basically made the long-term commitment and they stayed with it. And I think that was critical to bring it to the General Assembly, and that was an incredible foothold into the international process, so to speak. But of course, we all know that many international processes go down in flaming disasters, so that doesn't necessarily spell success. It would be nice, obviously, to say that, Oxfam and Amnesty and other international organizations were stepped up and mobilized their global membership in ways that they had not done before, and so that, for example, the U.S. Embassy was getting harangued by members in Mali as well as in Bhutan, or and here in the United States. In other words, the world did become smaller, and we were much better about communicating, mobilizing, and coordinating. That too was important. In the end, one could also argue that the change of administration here in the United States, from the Bush administration to the Obama administration, and the decision that the U.S. was going to change its position, was also a critical development, because we were out in the wilderness, so to speak, with the U.S. involvement. And I completely agree with Rachel that this was something that the U.S. needed to be inside, as opposed to outside shooting flamethrowers. Those would be some of the key things. I mean, you can look at small initiatives and projects, spokespersons that may have developed awareness, or may have consolidated awareness into something. You got your groups of activists, but those, I think, were, every campaign has that. I would list those. I don't know, Rachel, if you
Yeah, I mean, I think there had been momentum built. As I said at the beginning, this wasn't something that just appeared out of nowhere. And so I think where at the UN level, where it got traction was when UK Foreign Minister Jack Straw made a statement that this was a priority for the United Kingdom government, which is one of the largest exporters. So the UK government was joined by 6 other governments at the UN. They were called the original co-authors, representing basically every region of the world. So you had Australia from the Pacific, you had Argentina from South America, you had Costa Rica with a nod to obviously the contribution of Oscar Arias from Latin America, Central America. You had Finland, Japan, Kenya, all involved kind of leading this initiative. And so you had, again, those are not, with the exception of the United Kingdom, who has, as a permanent 5 member of the Security Council, has a different role. But these are not the countries that you think of as, you know, generally the leaders in international diplomacy. And I think having that group of 7 that basically stayed together and worked in concert for 7 years was really important. Now, obviously, that group has now grown. Now it's like there's a 12 that was the original 12 that moved it from the conference to the GA, and of course it's going to grow as we see the treaty get signatures and enter into force. But even today, there's still talk about having those original 7 plus a few others as the first signers of the treaty on June 3rd. So I think there's really been a political commitment from these governments. Those foreign ministers showed up in 2012 at the first go around at the treaty, and then again in 2013. And I think that's important because a lot of times, you know, especially with changing administrations or different governments in power, you know, they lose momentum. They're not as interested. They find their next pet project, and to have that sustained energy and engagement, I think, was important.
Well, thank you very much, Rachel Stoll from the Stimson Center, and thank you to Adote Akwe from Amnesty International. I'm Carl Levan from American University, and Estelle, who's one of the organizers, is going to offer some very brief closing remarks and thanking people for coming. That was the last one.
Incorporate that
okay.
Right in the mic.
You can ask us afterwards.
No, you should put it right
Can
in the
I-
record.
So can I ask my question?
Closing remarks. Go.
Closing.
Closing remark.
Okay. Well, thank you, everybody. Thank you so much. I think we can all applaud the panelists. So I think we had a very good discussion. I encourage you to go sign the petition to encourage the administration to sign on the treaty starting June 3rd. And I'm going to try and just put my question right in as well. I just had, I personally do not believe in the necessity of weapons and arms because I don't believe that the military is the first institution you need to strengthen in order to build a nation. So having been part of this, of the fulfillment of an idea that used to be once idealistic, do you believe that there could be another side of the story, so another momentum, another movement that would be to stop completely the trade of weapons?
That's a good last question.
Thank you very much.
I think that takes us right back to where we started off with Marcus Raskin and the intention of the Arms Control and Disarmament Agency. So thank you for your optimism. Thank you for your hope. And you're going to need that fire in your belly and that vision and that commitment and that unwavering integrity to find the right answer to that question. And one place you can look for answers is the Institute for Policy Studies. So keep hanging around here. Thanks for coming.